So thank you. I'm a big gratitude guy. I'm from the Midwest. So I'm going to first obviously thank the CSCCa for inviting me up here to do this. I think it's probably one of the most humbling experiences I've had so far. I think the world of this organization. I've been a card-carrying member now for several years, and it's really cool to be up here standing here talking to you about periodization this morning. I also have to thank you guys for waking up for the 8 a.m. shift. Even though we're strength coaches and we're used to waking up early, I know that the past couple days have been long days filled with education and long nights filled with new connections and seeing old friends and everything like that. So I really appreciate everybody coming out. Before I get going, I'm going to point out my contact information here because this is, got really excited. Point out my contact information here because this is the only place it appears. Like any good millennial, I have, of course, included my Twitter handle, but if you prefer to reach out via email or anything, I love talking training and learning from you guys, so please feel free to reach out after this. But I wanted to talk about periodization this year because I thought it was especially relevant. Periodization obviously goes under a great deal of scrutiny, but that's not why I wanted to have this discussion. I think that as strength conditioning coaches, we have to do so many things and be so many things now more than ever. Like, we have to be experts in physiology, we have to be biomechanists, we have to be, statisticians and pedagogists and leaders and mentors. And when you have to wear so many hats, it's very nice to have a unifying theory, a blueprint, a strategy that underlies your training process and helps your athletes compete in the highest levels. And I also thought that it would be especially relevant to talk about how athlete monitoring fits into periodization, and periodization guides the athlete monitoring process simply because athlete monitoring is more accessible than it's ever been, and it's being utilized to a great extent all across the country. And so I wanted to not completely dissociate athlete monitoring and periodization, but actually talk about how these two things help each other out. And in the discussion today, I'm probably going to talk about a lot of the familiar to you, so telling you things you already know, but I hope to kind of provide a unique spin on the familiar. And also in our discussion, I am not here to sell you anything. I hope to be pragmatic and not dogmatic, and I don't have an agenda, so I want to just talk about concepts. And with concepts, I thought it was most appropriate to start with the collective goals of periodization. And the first goal of periodization, again, I'm telling you things you already know, but is to properly manage fatigue and to minimize the potential for overtraining and injury. And this is actually kind of attack point number one for people who think that periodization is dead. And that if they just properly manage recovery and enhance readiness, that at the end of the day, their athletes will be more prepared for competition than those that, maybe follow a periodized process. And I'm not devaluing the importance of acute fatigue management and readiness and proper recovery adaptation, but what's really missing from goal number one, what it needs is that adaptation piece, and that the second goal of periodization gives it. That periodization aims to positively alter physiology, creating a new set point, essentially, of what this athlete is capable of through a summation of training effects. But it's not summation for the sake of summation, and it's actually predicated on having proper fatigue management. So I won't be able to positively alter physiology unless I properly manage fatigue, but this second portion here highlights the kind of mutually dependent nature of all the components of our training process. It's not physiology for the sake of physiology. It's a very specific type of physiology that meets the demands that our athlete faces in their sport. And so by creating this new subset this new set point, of physiology, and by properly managing fatigue, then we have a greater likelihood of being successful in competition. But the most important thing of this third goal is that it's the first portion where we have a consideration of time. And that's what periodization does for us is it helps us to logically organize and manage huge amounts of time. And it's also worth pointing out at this point that as strength conditioning coaches, that we don't own periodization. Periodization is used in the arts, it's used in math. It's used to describe and to provide objectives to periods of time. And this is how we use it, is to work towards these three goals. And this consideration of time then becomes the most important portion of periodization, essentially, that helps us be optimally prepared when we need the athletes to be optimally prepared. And we do that through a series of tenets, and this is going to be a very Reader's Digest version of the Reader's Digest versions of the history of periodization. And it's also the point in the talk where I just mispronounced a ton of names, but I'm just going to steer into the skid and kind of go with it for the sake of illustrating a point. And the first point that I want to demonstrate here is that the tenets of periodization have been around for a long time. They've passed the tests, they've withstood the rigors of high-level athletics, and they have brought a lot of people to podiums and national championships and all of everything in between. But the other thing I want to demonstrate is that these tenets kind of come up at different periods of time over and over again, and you'll see some fluidity in kind of when these boxes pop up. But if my timeline really wanted to start at the beginning, it would be like thousands of years BC with ancient Rome and Greece and China and all those people who use kind of organization to optimize the preparation of soldiers and some beginnings of weightlifting competitions. I started in 1896 for the sake of not being exhaustive, and it starts with a professor named Władysław Krajewski, and he was a Polish-born Russian citizen that gave us a lot of really important things regarding periodization. He gave us organization through optimization, or optimization through organization, excuse me. He gave us that we should probably have an uninterrupted and continuous training process, that the training process should consider a variety of scientific disciplines, have proper sequencing, and go from extensive to intensive workloads. And Dr. Krajewski was also very interested in athlete monitoring. He looked at the sleep patterns of his athletes and how those sleep patterns changed in response to training. And then we move into the 1900s, and we have Kotov in 1917 giving us that we should divide the year into cycles and phases with stages. Again, kind of re-emphasizing going from extensive to intensive workloads. But also, there's a man by the name of Beerson who gave us a consideration of moving from general to specific. And he looked at it more from a long-term athlete development standpoint, that when the athlete is a youth, that we should work on general fitness qualities, and then as they progress towards physical maturity, that's when they go towards sport specialization as well. But nonetheless, it provides us this tenet. And as we continue to move through, periodization and the maturation of it kind of goes worldwide. We have Finnish-born Piccola and Dyson from the United Kingdom and some others that considered an individualized response to training and gave us plan variation and restitution, which ultimately leads to this next one of actually our first goal, which is to reduce the likelihood of overtraining and injury. And then we have Letinov, who had a very physiology-driven approach to the training process, and it was more from a circadian rhythm standpoint. He liked the natural kind of biorhythms or whatever of how you would distribute workloads based on that. But nonetheless, it was kind of a move away from the calendar and towards physiology. But it also stimulated a conversation by people like Osselin that said, hey, do we need a list of objective laws of, rules of thumb that guide the training process? And that's where Matviev comes in, gives us some consideration of how we should structure workloads over the course of the year. And this scalability piece, the scalability of time, was really important. Microcycles, mesocycles, macrocycles, all of that good stuff. And how there is a summation of training effects. And then you have Dr. Verkhoshansky and Dr. Viru giving us quite a bit, mostly in the scientific evolution and what it means to be evidence-based. But they also obviously gave us a great deal of consideration with proper sequencing of training through like conjugate sequencing and things like that. And then they also kind of augmented workload structure through unidirectional concentrated loading. And also, really happy with this clicker this morning. We also had Dr. Mike Stone come into the picture there, who's our first American along this timeline, who's obviously very special to me because I'm at East Tennessee State University, and it's really cool to talk about Dr. Stone's place in the history of periodization. But Dr. Stone gave us the hypothetical model, which had sequencing, workload distribution, summation of training effects, all of that good stuff. And then we enter kind of the modern era, or where we are now, and some really great names like Coach Vermeil, and we have Vampa and some others that gave us context-specific evidence that's all kind of driven by this ongoing athlete monitoring piece, and we have a greater need to forecast training needs and responses, et cetera, but nonetheless, these are kind of what we're going to move forward with in our discussion today. And I was really inclusive here, for the sake of a good-looking picture, obviously, but I was very inclusive, and I was kind of on the border of programming with some of these, and I acknowledge that. And so I thought it was important next to kind of make that distinction between periodization and programming. That periodization includes these things. A lot of the objectives I've already gone through with managing fatigue and optimizing performance, general to specific, all that, so I'm not going to spend any time there. But periodization deals with fitness phases and timelines and how we organize those and how we assign objectives to those. And timelines demonstrates a piece that I'm going to spend some time discussing today in terms of the scalability. That the nature of workload distribution looks similar as we zoom in and zoom out of the process. If we consider the long-term development of an athlete from youth to adulthood, or what we as college strength and conditioning coaches have to deal with quite a bit of a quadrennial for an Olympic athlete or a collegiate career, unless they leave after 1, 2, or 3 years to go be a professional. Annual plans on down to a single session. We have similarity in the way workloads are structured through this aspect of periodization, but periodization also deals with fitness phases. GPP, or accumulation if you like that better, SPP being transmutation, and competitive periods being realization, or it also considers active rest and transitionary periods, things we know. Programming, however, is concerned with these things. And I know we're all well past the training variables, so I'm not going to go into any detail on those, but I do want to point out something up top here with these strategies, and this is where it can get kind of confusing. And I was talking to somebody the other day about this, that phase potentiation or conjugate sequencing, those kind of horizontal integrations of the training process, those are actually kind of macro cycle level programming decisions. So yeah, they're a broad look, but they're essentially programming. And planned overreaching or functional overreaches, where we purposely stress the athlete to a greater extent, that's actually a microcycle level programming decision. Same thing with tapering. It might span a microcycle or two, but it's a micro/mesocycle level programming decision. So it's pretty clear to see that these two things are not the same, but it's also very easy to see that they're not completely dissociated from each other either. But if we have a periodization-driven programming model, that's going to be where we are most successful. And I'll talk about why that is here in a moment, but essentially what we have here is a warning that if we don't get our terminology correct, that we might lead ourselves to confusion and argument and misapplication of principles. And we've been warned about this before. This is the death of periodization, and that some really big time names warned us. I'm just going to read this, that if there's one self-limiting tendency among strength conditioning professionals, it's that we often focus too much on numerical models, programming, rather than the underlying strategy when designing our program. And this warning mostly comes in the complex nature and the complex environment and the complex people, the athletes that we have to prescribe training to, and that we have a choice of matching our very complex situation with an equally complex solution or a programming-based decisions, or we can match our very complex solution or very complex situation with a simple tenet blueprint-driven strategy. And this is where I'm going to go outside of our field. And number one, acknowledge that college athletics and the preparation of our athletes is really complex. But I was recently turned on to a book by Corey Kennedy, my friend from up in Canada. And this book is called Risk Savvy, How to Make Good Decisions. If you want to read it, it's a really quick read and everything. But this author is another name I'm probably mispronouncing, by Gigerenzer is his name. But he essentially takes a multidisciplinary consideration of how to manage risk. So for us, this speaks to injuries, this speaks to illness, schedule changes, uncertainties that we have to deal with, or collectively I call these contingencies. And Gigerenzer argues that in finance and in medicine and some other disciplines, that when we are faced with high levels of uncertainty compared to low levels of uncertainty, that simple methods will outperform complex ones. So in our case, periodization-driven programming models would outperform kind of these really intricate, complex programming type of models. That sounds a lot like college athletics to me. He also goes on to say that when we have many alternatives available to us to solve these problems, so when I can prescribe any kind of training program that I want, when there are many alternatives, that simple methods, tenet-driven models like periodization, a blueprint, will outperform complex methods. And that sounds like college athletics in the situation that we're dealing with. He goes on to say that when we have small amounts of data available to us to help us make these decisions, that simple methods will outperform complex ones. And this is where people are like, well, man, I thought you were going to talk about athlete monitor. I have tons of data. I have GPS, force plates, collect RPEs, sleep, all that stuff. I have so much data, I can really make things complicated. But remember that this author was looking at finance, medicine, fields that have infinitely more data than we have. So relative to them, yeah, we have more data than ever, and that's amazing. But relative to these other fields where he's making these arguments, we exist in that box where simple methods will outperform very complex ones in terms of managing the risks that we are having to deal with on a day-to-day basis. And this demonstration of simple methods kind of controlling complexity comes in something that's a little bit abstract as it relates to the training process, with fractal dynamics and how that relates to physiology and the training process in general. And I'm going to explain what fractals are here in a moment, but essentially what we have is a representation of complexity through this kind of systemic organization that is provided through periodization. And it kind of looks like this. This painting is an example of fractal dynamics. It has self-similar recurring patterns, or these wave-like patterns, recurring at progressively smaller scales. Sounds like microcycle to mesocycle to macrocycle, and how we have workload distribution there. What fractals do better than anything is represent very complex and adaptive systems. And another example of this would be a snowflake, has fractal qualities. And fractals represent complex adaptive systems very well, so that again sounds like the situation that we have. And it looks a lot like the training process, and I've very strategically chosen this picture because it looks an awful lot like the wave-like pattern that you see in that painting. And this is an example of conjugate sequencing. And basically what we have demonstrated in this picture of the training process now is that the interrelatedness and the coordination between the components of the training process at different scales, and that's not really demonstrated in this picture of the scalability of time here, but that increases the overall functionality of our training process, which is demonstrated by this kind of arbitrary increase in preparedness there, demonstrated in conjugate sequencing. So the organization provided there enhanced the likelihood of preparedness when we got to realization. But it also helps us in control for perturbations. And perturbations in our world, injuries, illnesses, changes to the schedule, etc. But if we've assigned an objective to a period of time, we've managed the components towards that objective, we've logically sequence those components, then we can better control for when somebody rolls an ankle or, you know, gets sick or misses a workout or whatever the case may be, because we have that kind of systemic organization in place. But the really cool thing about fractal dynamics is that it fits very nicely into physiology. And here's another new spin on the familiar with the general adaptation syndrome curve. And we're going to zoom all the way in on it. That we prescribe a training stimulus to our athlete, and these things happen immediately. They experience tension and damage and metabolic disturbances leading to central nervous system fatigue, maybe due to a drop in blood glucose, maybe a drop in neurotransmitter levels. They might also experience metabolite and byproduct accumulation, hydrogen ions, ADP, and organic phosphates, all that good stuff. If the training is intensive enough, we might have damage like Z-disc streaming and plasma membrane disruption and some sort of substrate depletion, probably as a result of this training as well, which leads to a temporary decrease in performance and an increase in muscle soreness, stuff we know. And then early on, we have an increase in protein synthetic machinery through tension-mediated cell signaling pathways, eventually leading to mTOR, maybe an increase in the T-to-C ratio. Testosterone goes up as we kind of go through this planned variation and restitution process, proper nutrition, all of that stuff goes into this, leading to transcription and translation level events related to mRNA. We might have fiber type transitions, maybe some motor learning type of adaptations with dendritic branching, and bioenergetically we have an increase in the synthesis and activity of some specific enzymes based on what we decided to do in that training. That leads to these things: an increase in motor abilities, substrate storage or substrate supercompensation, maybe a bigger muscle, long-term potentiation, increases in neural drive. These things happen that ultimately lead to an increase in the potential to be successful in their sport. If we don't properly manage this process, whether by, you know, overwhelming them with too intensive of a stimulus or prescribing it too early or too late, which speaks again, kind of scheduling in the time-dependent manner that periodization helps out with, we experience, or the athlete experiences, involution, non-functional overreaching, or overtraining syndrome. Again, stuff we've all, you know, seen before with this general adaptation syndrome curve. But as we zoom out on this now, on this same exact curve, this portion of the general adaptation syndrome curve looks a lot like accumulation. This portion of the curve looks a lot like what would happen in transmutation. This, like realization. And if we want to be inclusive, this might be a transitionary or active rest period. So we've demonstrated now the scalability of time as it relates to the general adaptation syndrome. That self-similarity gives rise to the overall functionality of our training process through consideration of the gas. But if we expand that out even further, and now we have the stimulus, fatigue, recovery, adaptation theory, continuing to zoom in, we've demonstrated that performance follows physiology and it follows a dose-response relationship. We also get that there's a time limit to favorable responses as we continually zoom in on that. But as we zoom out, we get that there's a summation of training effects as a function of time. In order to string these gas curves together, we need time to pass, and we need to manage that time in order to end up there and not somewhere down here. More importantly, we're going to end up there in a specific way to our athletes if we acknowledge the presence of immediate, delayed, and residual training effects and manage those aspects towards that summation. So again, we have this mutual dependency of our components that we have to manage, but it's managed now through this kind of fractal dynamics nature that periodization gives us. But now periodization has this augmentation through athlete monitoring. The periodization does a great job in itself of leveraging necessities, and necessities include biological laws, physiological truths, essentially, that help guide the training process. But through athlete monitoring, underneath the umbrella of periodization, we now have very context-specific scientific information to training process. And if we truly understand the role of athlete monitoring, then we can leverage it to its greatest usage. And I think that relationship is pretty similar to that of a tailor, and that the tailor has a bunch of tools available to them. Using those tools, they make measurements. Based on those measurements, they might make alterations, they might make changes, but they never lose sight of the coordinated effect of all the components that go into making Don Draper look awesome. They can never lose sight of the entire look when whether they fix a pattern on that suit or even an individual stitch. It all has to be within the context of the entirety of the look. And that's very similar to what we have as a coach. That now we have more technology and things available to us than ever to make these measurements. And we make measurements. We might make alterations, changes, adjustments based on what those measurements give us. But as a coach, I can never lose sight of what this guy has to be on the field. I can never lose sight of the coordinated effects of my training on his performance on field and what he needs to be prepared on the field. And that's where periodization and athlete monitoring are really kind of merged together, is in that consideration. So the utility of athlete monitoring, I think, is pretty exhaustive. But I think it starts with a consideration of the dose-response relationship that's been mentioned previously with our, kind of consideration of the gaps and some other things. But that comes through observation, that comes through prior data and information, and it comes through experience. Like we're coaches, and that time that we spend with our athletes, or the time that we've been in this field, is important, especially as we consider this initial utility of athlete monitoring. But dose response then feeds into when we have contingencies. And contingencies, again, are those bad things, those uncertainties, the fatigue, the illness, the injuries. Whenever one of those things happens, it feeds back and gives us information on how to refine and optimize dose response. It also feeds forward and gives us an ability to generate a hypothesis, or design a program that's going to elicit a specific effect on our athletes. And I call that training potential, which I'm certain I stole from somebody, but I'm up here, so I'm going to say that I made it up. But that training potential is going to feed forward into the training effect, which is where we have to come in and assess again. We have to collect data, we have to be evidence-based, both context and generally scientific, and we have to see whether or not that training potential panned out, and to what extent and exactly how it worked. And that training effect is going to feed all the way back to dose response and inform that process and start the loop over, but it's also going to give us obviously information on the performance potential of our athletes, or the capabilities of the system, what that athlete can now do specifically related to their sport as a result of the effects of training. And that is going to feed all the way back and start the process over again, because wins and losses matter. And I'm sure all of us were, former athletes, or, at some point, I'm really competitive. And when my athletes win, that loop is really, really good, and it starts over, and we kind of maybe refine and things go well, but when that process doesn't go well, we need to reflect on that, and athlete monitoring helps us do that. And to provide an example of all of these things, dose response first, I have a strong athlete and a weak athlete. Training strain is on the x-axis here, and RSI modified is on the y-axis, and that's collected through counter movement jumps on a force plate. And we can see just by looking at the curves that these athletes responded very differently to very similar magnitudes of training strain, because they're team sports athletes, so they experience very similar training loads or training strains. But our strong athlete kind of had a stable response when he was less than 500 arbitrary units, responded very well to high training strains, but in that Goldilocks zone, they had an unfavorable response. I know I'm not comparing apples to apples, but this looks a lot like a polarized training model. Would be pretty effective, like high-low for this athlete. The weak athlete basically did the exact opposite. Unfavorable response to both low and high training strains, but they're in the middle in that Goldilocks zone. They had a favorable response. And again, I know I'm not comparing apples to apples, but that to me looks a lot like Tim Gavitt's acute chronic ratio figure. And that maybe that type of approach to workload distribution would be effective for that athlete. But nonetheless, what's probably most apparent is that these two athletes respond very differently. And we have to acknowledge that individuality, and we can acknowledge it through athlete monitoring. But I can only acknowledge that individuality if I'm also considering my training process and periodization, because it gives context to this consideration of individuality. But here we have this kind of time spectrum here, the step-by-step process, that we have a training stimulus that kind of feeds into this filter, this response matrix. And this response matrix includes things like genotype and age, gender, hormonal status, nutrition, immunological status. A lot of things go into this filter. And that's going to drive whatever cell signaling does take place. And you'll notice that the only solid line is right here between cell signaling and adaptation. Everything else is a dotted line because there's more factors to consider in my simplified model here. That with a dotted line, we only have association, we don't have cause and effect. But right here with cell signaling driving a new subset or a new set point of physiology, that's a direct cause and effect relationship. And that adaptation is going to have an association with the adaptation effect, which is essentially going to be our transfer to sport. So we have a relationship, but not direct cause and effect, except right there. And that's how we need to consider individuality within the context of athlete monitoring, because that's going to help drive our hypothesis or our training plan or our training process. And this is what we generally use at East Tennessee State. This is an adapted figure from Dr. Stone's presentations, but it's most notably, I guess, from a pair of papers by Minetti and Zamparo that basically did this huge lit search and came up with this as a kind of best practice sequencing to the training process, and that we start by emphasizing changes in cross-sectional area, muscle mass, architecture, all that good stuff. By making the muscles bigger, we give them a greater potential for force production. That way, when we emphasize maximum strength or high-end force in training, we can hopefully meet that potential. And then by getting the athletes stronger, they have a greater potential now for power production. And then when we emphasize power and express power in training, they have a greater likelihood of adapting. And along the way, some of these things also happen. But what this also demonstrates is periodization in a nutshell. General to specific, extensive to intensive, a lot of the components are here within our discussion of athlete monitoring and constructing training potential. But it also gives us a very important distinction between expression and development. And this is where we fall short too many times. It's just because I have a power block does not mean I'm developing power, it means I'm expressing it for 2 to 4 weeks. But through proper sequencing, through this mutually dependent nature of all the components of the training process, that's how you achieve development rather than expression. And this is how we aim to achieve it with our baseball guys in the fall. That we started in basic strength. I know, like, I didn't start with strength endurance or hypertrophy work, but we inherited these guys halfway through the fall. And just so based on the information we had, they had done some volume intensive work prior to coming to us, so we decided to start in basic strength. And you can see the sets and reps that we used, the relative intensities we used. We used the set rep best method. It's kind of outside the scope of our discussion today, but we had very basic exercise selection because we wanted to emphasize technique. We wanted to teach the athletes how to properly load within our relative intensity system. And we also wanted to give them an introduction to force producing characteristics. as we moved through our training process, we dropped the volume a little bit, went to 3 sets of 3, and you can see a planned restitution week here in the 3rd week there. But we increased the complexity of movement, included some more dead videos evidently. No, there he goes. So some more complete lifts or some more complex derivatives essentially. Some higher end loading. We wanted to emphasize absolute strength development or very high ends of force production. We used down sets to kind of introduce some strength speed qualities, but it was by no means the primary or even secondary emphasis at this point in training. And that then led us to another absolute strength block. We started with a functional overreach, going with 4 sets of 3 to retain some of that previously accrued volume that we haven't visited in a while. But then we had 3 sets of 2, very high end absolute loading to emphasize that absolute strength. But we also expanded our use of warm up and warm down sets to include things like the counter movement shrug that you see there, to kind of introduce them as we concluded this microcycle to some speed strength and some high end power production. And that all sounds well and good, but we had to assess our training effect. Now, providing an example of that component of athlete monitoring, and this is how we did it. We first assessed anthropometrics, body mass, limb girths that included like arm, chest, glutes, thighs, some different things, and then a sum of skin folds. The athletes then proceeded to do a series of loaded static jumps, 0 on up to 80 kilos in 20 kilogram increments. The primary variables that we looked at here were the jump height and the allometrically scaled peak power, so the peak power scaled to body mass because global output matters. But we also wanted a description of how they were producing that power across the spectrum of loads. So we have force at peak power and velocity at peak power. We also had them do an isometric mid-thigh pull, where we looked at the allometrically scaled or the scaled to body mass isometric peak force. We also looked at the rate of force development at 50 milliseconds and the impulse at 150 milliseconds, and those critical time points were chosen because they relate to baseball performance. Rate of force development at 50 milliseconds is mostly associated with punching, like a boxer. And so we thought that that was probably very similar to the arm action of a pitcher or the point of contact with a hitter. And so we wanted to assess the rate of force development at 50 milliseconds. Impulse at 150 milliseconds was our kind of indicator for sprint potential. And we chose 150 milliseconds rather than the classic like ground contact time of 100 milliseconds because these guys play on turf and dirt. And so we needed to balloon that out a little bit in order to be specific to the surface that they play on. And in that assessment, here's kind of what happened. That this guy has 2 centimeters on average, actually, the team average, a 2 centimeter increase in chest girth, 1 centimeter increase in glute girth, 3 centimeters on average increase in thigh girth, and 2 kilos of lean body mass were added on average. Pretty good for 9 weeks. We were happy with that, especially considering we didn't do any very voluminous work. And this guy also, when I asked him if I could use his picture, wanted me to point out that he's leading the conference in home runs and doubles and RBIs and all those things too. So he's like, yeah, you can use my picture, but you gotta tell everybody that. So this guy's pretty good. We didn't make him that way. God did probably. But that led to a pretty substantial increase in isometric peak force, so their high-end force production. About a 9% increase on average. Still have a ways to go, but the arrow is definitely pointing upwards there, which led to huge increases in rate of force development at 50 milliseconds, which that's going to be, that 25% increase is going to be mostly driven by changes in absolute strength. We also, though, had a 3% drop in impulse at 150 milliseconds, or quite honestly, a negligible change. And did we do a bad job? And this is where periodization and athlete monitoring come together again, and that now we have context through periodization to where we are at in our data collection and the effects of our training. And that's further demonstrated here if we look at the static jumps now. I know this is a ton of numbers, and here we have our 0 on down to 80 kilos, jump height, peak power, force at peak power, velocity at peak power. And these are Cohen's d effect sizes, along with their practical interpretation. So basically the meaningfulness of the changes that we have in our jump variable. And this isn't a stats lesson or anything, but it does pretty much demonstrate that we did an okay job. A lot of things have the arrow pointing up, even to a small degree. But some things didn't change, or even maybe got ever so slightly worse. But like, just so you guys know a little bit of Cohen's d effect sizes, that's about as negligible as a change as negligible can be. So we essentially see no change. But in the way the changes are coming about is very unique in that we basically have most of our positive changes in force production related variables, demonstrated here with our force at peak power, or at the higher end loads of our static jumps. So ultimately, we are affecting force production characteristics more than anything right now through our training. And that makes sense. If we keep an eye on our objective, this is the old faithful force velocity curve, and essentially we focused on shifting this portion of the curve upwards. But as we proceeded into the next macrocycle, into SPP, we put a greater emphasis on shifting that portion of the force velocity curve, though this one didn't go away because we're believers that you can never be strong enough, and that strength is the kind of tide that makes all ships rise. And so this emphasis in absolute strength development, maximum strength development did not go away, but there was definitely in our SPP a greater emphasis on the velocity end of that force velocity curve. All in all, trying to push everything upwards and to the right to increase the power production potential of our athletes to develop power rather than simply expressing it. And in that, we leverage organization or periodization to, number one, give context to that information, but also to help us control for that chaos that I talked about earlier with college athletics and preparing athletes at this level. Each one of these little green dots represents a prescribed training stimulus, and at each one of those, the athlete could go a number of ways. Remember back that we have a lot of uncertainties, and the green line represents that the athlete got better, blue, the athlete stayed the same, red, obviously, that the athlete got worse. This is completely arbitrary, and this is called the contingency necessity model, in that we have all these contingencies to deal with. Remember, contingencies were the unknown, the uncertain, the injuries, the risks, but we need to leverage necessities, which now through periodization we have general and context-specific necessities, that through organization, by assigning an objective to a period of time, and by managing the components towards that objective, and by logically organizing that management and leveraging self-similarity and scalability and all of these things, we have a greater likelihood in a very complex, crazy environment of being successful when we get to the end of the competitive season. And overall now we just need to trust the guided process. We have a more guided process than ever, but it doesn't make what we have known for many, many years irrelevant. Because periodization helps us to navigate those uncertainties by kind of letting physiology and biomechanics run the show. And periodization also coordinates athlete monitoring. Athlete monitoring can't exist without periodization, but periodization can exist without athlete monitoring. And so underneath the umbrella of periodization, that's where athlete monitoring sits. And in that, athlete monitoring can help us emphasize the relevant information and to ultimately optimize our process and then give us context to the science that's driving that process. Overall, again, minimizing the risks, the uncertainties, maximizing scientific truths, and that's where we want to exist, because that's going to increase our likelihood of being successful, or our athletes rather, of being successful on the highest of levels. And I'm fortunate enough to be at a place where, my introduction mentioned, I get to work alongside somebody who prepares Olympians. 100% of the 7 Olympians that came out of our training site followed a periodized program that was informed through athlete monitoring. And so I've seen this work at many different levels now, and so that's kind of where I think we are today, is that periodization is not irrelevant, it's probably better than ever. It's probably more relevant than ever. And we can't forget it. We've got to just acknowledge the refinements that have happened as a result of the evolution of our field and continue to leverage these tenets that are not going anywhere because they have withstood the test of time. They've passed the test. I appreciate you guys listening today. Before I conclude here, I told you I'm from the Midwest, big gratitude guy. I want to thank you guys again for coming out, but these four people, Dr. Mike Stone, Coach Meg Stone, whose picture is right out there, she's a Hall of Famer, Dr. Brad DeWeese and Dr. Kimmy Sato are my mentors now at East Tennessee State, and they have invested more in me in the past 2 years than I could have ever imagined. If you ever get the chance to come down to Johnson City and meet these people, please do so. It's an open door, and they are outstanding. They are better people than they could ever be practitioners, and that is not a slight at their ability to be awesome coaches and scientists and everything like that. They are truly the best. And then this gentleman on the far side here is Mac Calloway, and Mac gave me my first job in strength conditioning as an intern and as an assistant. And I know that every single one of you are sitting out there because somebody took a chance on you at some point. And for that, I'm forever grateful to Mac and to many, many, many other people. But I'm going to spend the rest of my career, which is hopefully a very long one, trying to prove that guy right for taking a chance on me several years ago. So thank you guys again. Thanks CSCCa for having me. If anybody wants to catch up out there, I'll be here. Come on.